On a frozen January night, an elderly couple was forced into the street by their own son, carrying nothing but a trash bag of belongings, while $200 million sat waiting in their name, and their daughter-in-law had no idea what she'd just thrown away. Before we dive into the story, make sure to smash subscribe, because tomorrow we have an extra special story for you that will blow your mind. The wind cut through the streets of Millbrook like a knife that January evening. Temperatures had dropped to 18 degrees, the kind of cold that turned breath into clouds and made bones ache deep inside. Harold and Margaret stood on the front steps of the house they'd called home for the past 7 years, watching as their son Dennis carried their belongings out in 2 black trash bags. Not suitcases, not boxes, trash bags. Harold was 79 years old. His back bent from decades of work he'd never complained about. His hands, spotted with age and trembling slightly from the cold, clutched the railing as he descended the steps one at a time. Margaret, 76, held his arm with one hand and her worn canvas purse with the other. Her shoes were held together with duct tape. The coat she wore had been donated to her 3 Christmases ago. It barely kept out the wind. Dennis wouldn't look at them. He stood in the doorway, arms crossed, jaw tight. Behind him, his wife Patricia watched from the window, her face a mask of cold satisfaction. She'd been pushing for this moment for months. "You're taking up space we need," Dennis had said that morning, his voice flat and rehearsed. "The basement could be a rental unit. We can't afford to keep you here anymore." Harold had tried to speak, to reason with him, but Margaret had gently squeezed his hand. "It's all right," she'd whispered. "We'll figure something out." They always did. They'd figured things out their whole lives. But tonight, standing on the icy sidewalk with nowhere to go and darkness falling fast, Margaret wasn't so sure. The door closed behind them. They heard the lock click. Harold turned to look at the house one last time. The lights were warm inside. Through the window, he could see his grandson, little Nathan, only 8 years old, pressing his hands against the glass. The boy was crying. Patricia yanked him away from the window, and the curtain fell shut. Margaret felt something crack inside her chest. Not from the cold, but from the weight of it all. They walked slowly down the residential street. 2 figures bent against the wind, their shadows long and thin under the streetlights. Cars passed them without stopping. Neighbors who knew them pretended not to see. Harold carried both trash bags. Margaret held his arm to keep him steady. Neither of them spoke. What was there to say, but to understand how they ended up on that frozen sidewalk? You have to go back to the beginning of those 7 years in the basement. Back to when they still had hope that family meant something. 7 years earlier, Harold and Margaret had been living in a small rental apartment on the other side of town. Harold had worked as a maintenance man at the local high school for 42 years before his back finally gave out. Margaret had cleaned houses until arthritis made it impossible to grip a mop. Between them, they collected $947 a month in Social Security. The rent was $850. They were making it work. Barely. Eating 1 meal a day, walking everywhere to save on gas, wearing sweaters indoors to keep the heat bill low. But then the landlord sold the building. The new owner wanted to renovate, and he wanted them out. Dennis had seemed genuinely concerned when they told him. "You can't live on the street," he'd said. "Come stay with us. We have a basement. It's not much, but it's dry and warm." Patricia had smiled tightly. Of course. Family takes care of family. They should have seen the calculation in her eyes, should have heard the conditions hidden in her tone. But they were desperate, and desperation makes you blind to red flags. The basement wasn't finished. Concrete floors, exposed pipes, a single bare bulb hanging from the ceiling. There was a utility sink in the corner, and a toilet behind a thin partition that didn't reach the ceiling. The furnace rumbled and kicked on throughout the night, sometimes working, sometimes not. In the summer, it was unbearably hot. In the winter, it was damp and cold. Dennis brought down 2 twin mattresses from someone's curb and laid them on the floor. "It's temporary," he'd said. "Just until you get back on your feet. 7 years. 7 years of temporary." And Hinded sighed, and Hinded sighed, and Hinded sighed. At first, Patricia had been cordial. Distant, but cordial. She worked as a receptionist at a dental office and liked to remind everyone that she made more money than Dennis, who worked construction when the weather allowed. Money was always tight in their household. Always a source of tension. "We're struggling too," Patricia would say whenever Harold or Margaret asked for anything. "You need to understand that." So, they tried not to ask. They tried to be invisible. Harold would wake at 5:30 every morning, his back screaming in protest as he pushed himself up from the thin mattress. Margaret would already be awake, sitting on the edge of her bed, rubbing her swollen knuckles, trying to work feeling back into her fingers. They'd dress quietly in the dim light, pulling on the same worn clothes they'd washed by hand in the utility sink the night before. By 6, they'd be upstairs in the kitchen, not because they were invited, but because that's when Nathan needed to be ready for school. Patricia expected it. Harold would make breakfast, eggs and toast, whatever was in the fridge. Margaret would pack Nathan's lunch, always making sure to use ingredients Patricia wouldn't miss. Patricia would come downstairs at 6:45, perfectly dressed, makeup flawless, and inspect everything. "Nathan, did you brush your teeth? Did Grandpa remember to pack your homework? Margaret, you didn't use the good bread, did you?" Every morning, the same interrogation. Every morning, they'd pass the test, and she'd leave without saying thank you. Dennis would stumble down around 7, grab coffee, and head out. He'd nod at his parents, sometimes manage a weak smile, but he never stopped to talk, never asked how they slept or if they needed anything, just nodded and left. After they were gone, Harold and Margaret would clean the kitchen spotless, then return to the basement. They'd wait there, quiet as mice, until it was time to pick Nathan up from school at 3:15. That walk became Margaret's favorite part of the day. 22 minutes each way, hand in hand with Harold, watching the seasons change. In the fall, they'd shuffle through leaves. In the spring, they'd admire the flowers in people's yards. In the summer, they'd walk slowly, savoring the warmth. And in the winter, they'd bundle up and brave the cold together. Nathan would run to them when school let out, his backpack bouncing, his face bright with the kind of joy only an 8-year-old could muster. "Grandma, Grandpa, guess what we did today?" And for those 22 minutes walking home, listening to Nathan chatter about spelling tests and recess, and his best friend Marcus, Margaret felt like her life had purpose. But the moment they walked through the door, Patricia's rules took over. "Nathan, go do your homework. Don't bother your grandparents. They're tired." She'd say it kindly. But the message was clear. "You're here to be useful, not to bond with my son." Dinner was the worst part of every day. Patricia insisted Harold and Margaret eat with the family. But they weren't allowed to eat until everyone else had taken their portions first. "We need to make sure there's enough," Patricia would say, even when there was clearly plenty. Harold and Margaret would sit at the table, hands folded, watching Dennis, Patricia, and Nathan fill their plates. Only after everyone had started eating were they allowed to take what was left. Sometimes it was a full meal. Sometimes it was scraps. They never complained. Never said a word. After dinner, they'd wash the dishes while Patricia supervised, pointing out spots they'd missed, criticizing the way Margaret stacked the plates. Then they'd return to the basement, descending those wooden steps like prisoners returning to their cell. The basement had a small television Dennis had brought down, an old thing with bent rabbit ears that only picked up 3 channels. They'd watch the news together, sitting side by side on their mattresses, backs against the cold concrete wall. "Do you remember when we had our own place?" Margaret would sometimes whisper. "I remember," Harold would reply. "Do you think we'll ever have that again?" Harold would squeeze her hand. "I don't know. But we have each other. That's enough." Except it wasn't. Not really. Not when they could hear Patricia upstairs laughing with Nathan. Not when they could hear Dennis watching football. Not when they were so close to family but so completely shut out from it. The cruelty was never loud. It was quiet, insidious, the kind that accumulates like dust until you can't breathe. Patricia never yelled. She didn't have to. She'd just make small comments, little cuts that bled slowly. "You know, Harold, you're using a lot of hot water for your showers. We're trying to keep costs down. Margaret, I noticed you took 2 pieces of chicken last night. Were you extra hungry? I'm not saying you're a burden. I'm just saying we need to be mindful of expenses." And Dennis, he just let it happen. He'd sit there at the dinner table, eyes on his plate, while his wife slowly broke his parents down. Sometimes, Harold would catch his eye, and Dennis would look away, ashamed, but not ashamed enough to stop it. The breaking point came slowly. Then all at once. It started 3 months before that frozen January night. Patricia began talking about renovating the basement. "We could rent it out," she'd say casually over dinner. "Make some extra money. God knows we need it." Dennis would nod. "Could help with Nathan's school expenses." Harold and Margaret would exchange glances but say nothing. Where would they go? Then the hints became less subtle. "You know, Harold and Margaret, you've been here a long time. 7 years. That's longer than most people stay anywhere. We're grateful," Harold would say. "I know you are," Patricia would reply with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "But gratitude doesn't pay the bills." One morning in December, Patricia sat them down at the kitchen table. Dennis stood behind her, arms crossed, unable to meet their eyes. "We've made a decision," Patricia announced. "We're going to renovate the basement and rent it out. Which means you'll need to find somewhere else to live." Margaret's hand found Harold's under the table. "When?" Harold asked, his voice steady despite the panic rising in his chest. "End of January. That gives you almost 2 months to figure something out. But where will we go?" Margaret asked softly. Patricia shrugged. "I'm sure there are programs. Shelters. Senior housing. You'll figure it out. You're resourceful. We gave you everything," Harold said, his voice cracking for the first time in 7 years. "We raised you, Dennis. We sacrificed for you. And this is how you repay us." Dennis finally spoke, his voice weak and defensive. "It's not personal, Dad. It's just practical. We have to think about our family." "We are your family," Margaret whispered. "You know what I mean," Dennis said. But they did know. They knew exactly what he meant. They weren't his family anymore. They were a burden, an inconvenience, something to be discarded when they stopped being useful. Those last 2 months in the basement were unbearable. The pretense of civility disappeared. Patricia stopped asking them to help with Nathan, stopped inviting them to dinner. They'd hear the family eating upstairs, laughing and talking, while they sat in the basement with a package of crackers and some peanut butter Dennis had left on the stairs. "Don't come up unless it's absolutely necessary," Patricia had said. "We need our space, their space." In a house Harold and Margaret had paid rent to live in, had maintained, had cleaned, had poured 7 years of unpaid labor into. Nathan would sneak down sometimes after everyone was asleep. He'd sit on the floor between their mattresses, tears running down his cheeks. "Why do you have to leave?" he'd ask. "Because your mama and daddy need the room," Margaret would say, stroking his hair. "But I don't want you to go. You're the only ones who really listen to me." "We'll always listen to you," Harold promised. "But how will I find you?" Harold and Margaret had no answer for that. The night before the eviction, Harold couldn't sleep. He lay on his mattress, staring up at the exposed pipes and ductwork, listening to Margaret's labored breathing beside him. She'd been coughing for weeks, a deep, rattling cough that came from sleeping in a damp basement with inadequate heat. He reached into the pocket of his coat, hanging on a nail in the wall, and pulled out a folded piece of paper. It was yellow with age, the creases worn soft from being opened and closed countless times over 43 years. It was a letter from his Uncle Thomas, written just before he died. Harold had carried it with him everywhere, a reminder of a choice he'd made long ago, a choice that had defined his entire adult life. He unfolded it carefully in the dim light and read the words he'd memorized decades ago. "Harold, by the time you read this, I'll be gone. The estate, the accounts, the properties, all of it goes to you. You're the only family I have left. I know you'll say you don't want it. I know you'll try to refuse it. But it's yours, not because you deserve it, though you do, but because I trust you to use it wisely. Don't let pride keep you from accepting what's rightfully yours. And don't wait too long to claim it. The world moves fast. People forget. Paper gets lost. Take care of Margaret. She's the best thing that ever happened to you." Harold's eyes burned. He'd walked away from that inheritance 43 years ago, convinced that money corrupted people, convinced that a simple life was a better life. And he still believed that. Mostly. But lying on a thin mattress in a cold basement, knowing that tomorrow he and Margaret would be homeless in the middle of winter, he wondered if his pride had cost them everything. He folded the letter carefully and tucked it back into his pocket. "Tomorrow," he thought, "tomorrow, after we figure out where to sleep, I'll think about what to do with this." But tomorrow came faster and colder than he expected. The morning of the eviction, Patricia was up early. She'd clearly been planning this, had probably been counting down the days. She knocked on the basement door at 7 in the morning, not waiting for an answer before opening it. "Today's the day," she announced brightly, as if they were moving to a mansion instead of being thrown into the street. "Dennis will help you carry your things out. Can we at least stay until afternoon?" Harold asked. "Give us time to make some calls, find somewhere to go." Patricia's smile faded. "The contractor is coming at 9 to start the work. You need to be gone by then. It's 18 degrees outside," Margaret said, quietly. "Then I suggest you dress warmly." It took them 20 minutes to pack their entire lives into 2 trash bags. Clothes, a few photographs, Margaret's Bible, Harold's reading glasses, toiletries, and the letter. That was it. 7 years of living reduced to 2 bags of garbage. Dennis carried the bags up the stairs without saying a word. Harold helped Margaret up, step by painful step. When they reached the top, Nathan was standing in the hallway in his pajamas, tears streaming down his face. "Don't go," he sobbed. "Please, don't go." Patricia pulled him away. "Nathan, go to your room. This doesn't concern you, but Grandma and Grandpa." "Now, Nathan." The boy ran, his sobs echoing down the hallway. And that's how Harold and Margaret found themselves standing on the front steps in 18-degree weather, watching their son refuse to meet their eyes, watching the door close, hearing the lock click. They walked slowly down the residential street. Two figures bent against the wind. 3 blocks away, Margaret's legs began to give out. Harold guided her to a bench outside a closed laundromat. She sat heavily, gasping for air, her breath coming in short, painful bursts. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I just need a minute." Harold knelt in front of her, his knees cracking in protest. He took her cold hands in his. "Don't apologize. Not ever. Not for anything." He looked into her eyes, those same blue eyes he'd fallen in love with 56 years ago, and he made a silent vow. They would survive this. They always had. What Harold didn't know, what nobody in that God-forsaken town knew, was that 734 miles away, in a law office in Boston, a file sat on a desk, marked urgent. Inside that file was a trust document, a will, and a certified letter that had been returned 3 times marked address unknown. The document detailed an inheritance worth $207 million, and it belonged to Harold and Margaret. But on that frozen bench, with nowhere to go and darkness falling, Harold reached into his pocket one more time. His fingers found the letter, that yellowed piece of paper he'd carried for 43 years. He pulled it out, looked at it, and for the first time in decades, he allowed himself to wonder, what if? What if he'd made the wrong choice all those years ago? What if his pride, his fear of what money could do, had sentenced them both to a lifetime of poverty they didn't deserve? Margaret noticed him holding the letter. "What's that?" she asked through chattering teeth. Harold looked at her. This woman who had never questioned him, who had followed him into poverty without complaint, who deserved so much more than he'd ever been able to give her. "It's a mistake," he said quietly. "A mistake I'm going to fix." "What do you mean?" But before he could answer, a gust of wind tore the letter from his cold, stiff fingers. It tumbled across the sidewalk, skittering toward the street. Harold lunged for it, his old body protesting, but he managed to grab it before it blew into traffic. When he stood up, breathing hard, he saw Margaret watching him with an expression he couldn't quite read. "That letter," she said. "You've carried it for as long as I've known you. You've never told me what it says." Harold walked back to the bench and sat beside her. The cold bit through his thin coat, but he barely felt it. "It's from my Uncle Thomas, the one who raised me after my parents died. I remember. He died the year before we got married. He left me everything, Margaret. His entire estate, millions of dollars, and I walked away from it." Margaret stared at him. "Why?" "Because I was 23 and idealistic and stupid," Harold said. "I saw how money corrupted people, saw families torn apart fighting over inheritance. I didn't want that life. I wanted to build something real, something earned. I wanted us to make our own way. And we did," Margaret said softly. "And we did," Harold agreed. "For 56 years, we made our own way. We worked hard. We lived simply. We were happy, weren't we?" "We were," Margaret said. "We are." Harold looked at the letter in his hands, then at his wife, then at the empty street where cars passed without stopping. But maybe, he said slowly, maybe it's time to stop being so proud. Maybe it's time to claim what's ours. Not for me, but for you. You deserve better than this, Margaret. You deserve warmth and safety and dignity. Margaret was quiet for a long moment. Then she took the letter from his hands and read it, her eyes moving slowly across the faded ink. When she finished, she folded it carefully and handed it back. 43 years, she said. You've carried this for 43 years? He nodded. And you never told me? I was afraid you'd think I was foolish for walking away. Margaret laughed, a sound so unexpected in the cold that Harold startled. Foolish? Harold, I married a man who had $23 to his name and drove a car held together with wire and prayer. I knew what I was getting into. Then you're not angry? Angry? Margaret shook her head. I'm freezing, I'm tired, and I'm about to become homeless. But angry? No. If anything, I'm proud of you. Proud you could have taken that money and become someone else entirely. But you chose to be yourself. Chose to build a life based on work and love instead of inheritance. That takes courage. She paused, her breath forming clouds in the cold air. But, Harold, yes, I think it's time. Not because we need the money, but because we've earned the right to stop suffering. We've proved ourselves. We've lived with integrity for 56 years. We don't have anything left to prove. Harold felt something break loose in his chest. Some burden he'd been carrying for so long he'd forgotten it was there. Okay, he said. Okay. Tomorrow, I'll make the call. Not tomorrow, Margaret said firmly. Tonight. As soon as we find a warm place with a phone. They stood up together, Harold supporting Margaret, and began walking again. The temperature had dropped even further. The street lights flickered on, casting long shadows across the frozen sidewalk. 2 blocks ahead, they saw the steeple of First Baptist Church rising against the darkening sky. The building was dark, but Harold remembered the pastor saying once that the side door was always unlocked for those in need. Come on, he said to Margaret. Let's see if they really meant it. They made their way slowly to the church, climbed the steps, and tried the door. It opened. Inside, the hallway was dark but warmer than outside. They found a Sunday school room with carpet and a pile of donated blankets in the corner. Harold spread 2 blankets on the floor and helped Margaret lie down. He covered her with the remaining blankets, then lay beside her, holding her close. Tomorrow, he whispered. Tomorrow, everything changes. Margaret nodded against his chest. Do you think they'll believe you? After all this time? I don't know, Harold admitted. But I have to try. For you, for us. He felt her smile against his shirt. We'll figure it out. We always do. Outside, the temperature continued to drop. Inside, an elderly couple who'd spent 7 years in a basement, who'd been thrown away like garbage by their own son, who'd walked away from a fortune 43 years ago, finally closed their eyes and allowed themselves to hope. The letter sat in Harold's coat pocket, its words carrying the weight of decades and the promise of redemption. $207 million waited in trust, unclaimed and forgotten by everyone except the lawyers who'd been searching for its rightful owners for years. Tomorrow, Harold would make the call that would change everything. Tomorrow, the truth would begin to surface. Tomorrow, Patricia and Dennis would learn what they'd thrown away. But tonight, in a dark Sunday school room in a small church in Millbrook. Harold and Margaret simply held each other and survived, because that's what they'd always done. That's who they'd always been. And no amount of money, no matter how much, could change the fact that they'd built something real, something that couldn't be measured in dollars or destroyed by cruelty. They'd built a love that had lasted 56 years. And tomorrow, they'd finally have the resources to honor it the way it deserved to be honored. The morning after Harold and Margaret spent their first night in the church, they woke to the sound of footsteps in the hallway. A woman named Louise found them, brought them coffee and breakfast, and didn't ask too many questions. But as Harold sat in that church kitchen, warming his hands around a mug of coffee, his mind drifted back 56 years to where it all began. 1969. Harold was 23 years old, working as an apprentice electrician in Boston. He lived in a boarding house with 5 other men, sharing a bathroom and a hot plate. He had 2 pairs of pants, 3 shirts, and a work jacket with his name stitched over the pocket. Every Friday, he'd cash his paycheck and put half in a coffee can under his bed. The other half went to food, rent, and the occasional movie. He met Margaret at a church social. She was 20, working as a seamstress in a factory that made military uniforms. Her hands were always pricked with needle marks, her fingers stained with thread dye. She wore the same blue dress every Sunday, because it was the only nice thing she owned. Harold asked her to dance, and she said yes. 3 months later, he proposed with a ring he'd bought from a pawn shop for $17. She cried when she said yes, and he promised her they'd build a good life together. Not a rich life, but a good one. They married in that same church, with 12 people in attendance. Margaret wore a borrowed white dress. Harold wore his only suit, the one he'd inherited from his Uncle Thomas. After the ceremony, they went to a diner and split a piece of pie. Then they went home to the single room Harold had rented for them above a hardware store. "It's perfect," Margaret had said, looking at the tiny space with its slanted ceiling and cracked linoleum floor. "It's a dump," Harold replied honestly. "It's ours," she corrected. And that made all the difference. Those first years were lean but happy. Harold worked long hours, sometimes 70 or 80 hours a week. Margaret sewed at home, taking in alterations and repairs to make extra money. They ate a lot of beans and rice. They walked everywhere to save on bus fare. In the winter, they'd pile every blanket they owned on the bed and sleep pressed together for warmth. But they were building something. Saving money, planning for the future, talking about the family they'd have someday, the house they'd buy, the life they'd create through hard work and determination. Harold's Uncle Thomas had raised him after his parents died in a car accident when he was 9. Thomas was a businessman, successful in ways Harold never fully understood, something to do with manufacturing and patents. He lived in a big house in the suburbs, drove a new Cadillac, belonged to a country club, but Thomas had also been kind. He'd made sure Harold had everything he needed: food, clothes, education. He'd taught Harold about integrity, about the value of work, about treating people with respect, regardless of their station in life. "Money doesn't make the man," Thomas used to say. "Character does." Harold took those lessons to heart. Even as a teenager, watching his uncle's business associates, he'd seen how wealth changed people, made them petty and greedy and small. He watched relatives come crawling out of the woodwork whenever Thomas made a big deal, suddenly remembering they were family, suddenly needing favors. It disgusted him. So when he turned 18, Harold told his uncle he wanted to learn a trade. wanted to work with his hands, wanted to build a life based on what he could do, not what he could inherit. Thomas had smiled. "You're a good kid, Harold. Your parents would be proud." 6 months before Harold married Margaret, Thomas called him to the big house. It was a Sunday afternoon. Thomas was sitting in his study, looking older than Harold remembered, tired in a way that went beyond physical exhaustion. "Sit down, son," Thomas said. "We need to talk." Harold sat. "I'm dying," Thomas said plainly. "Cancer. They give me maybe 6 months, probably less." Harold felt the world tilt. "Uncle Thomas, let me finish," Thomas interrupted gently. "I've already made arrangements. My estate, all of it, goes to you. The house, the business interests, the investments, everything. I don't want it," Harold said immediately. "I know you don't. That's exactly why you should have it. Uncle Thomas, I'm building my own life. I'm going to marry Margaret. We're going to make our own way." Thomas leaned back in his chair. "And you should. But take the inheritance anyway. Put it in trust. Don't touch it if you don't want to. But have it there, just in case." "In case of what?" "In case life gets hard. In case you need it. In case your principles become a luxury you can't afford." Harold shook his head stubbornly. "I won't become one of those people who fight over money. I won't let wealth corrupt what Margaret and I are building." Thomas studied him for a long moment. "Then make me a promise. Take the inheritance, put it in trust, and if you still feel the same way in 20 years, give it all to charity. But don't refuse it out of pride. Pride is just fear dressed up in nobility." Harold wanted to argue, but Thomas looked so tired, so fragile. "Okay," he finally agreed. "I'll take it, but I won't touch it. Not a penny." "Fair enough," Thomas said with a small smile. "Just promise me one more thing." "What?" "Take care of that girl you're going to marry. She's got a good heart. Don't let your principles hurt her." "I won't," Harold promised. But that's exactly what he did. For the next 43 years, Thomas died 3 months later. The funeral was packed with people Harold didn't recognize, business associates and distant relatives and hangers-on, all of them trying to figure out who got what. Harold attended, stood in the back, and left before anyone could corner him with questions. The lawyers called a week later. The estate was substantial. After taxes and legal fees, it came to approximately $47 million in 1970. Adjusted for inflation and decades of careful investment, it would grow to over $200 million by 2013. Harold met with the lawyers once. Just once. He signed the papers, putting everything in an irrevocable trust with specific instructions. "Do not contact me unless I contact you first. Invest conservatively. Let it grow. And if I die without claiming it, donate everything to charity." The lead lawyer, a man named Robert Caldwell, tried to talk him out of it. "Mr. Whitmore, this is an enormous sum of money. You could live very comfortably. You could provide for your future family. Are you certain you want to walk away?" "Number 6, I'm certain," Harold said. "Can I ask why?" Harold thought about his uncle's business associates circling like vultures. Thought about family members he'd never met, suddenly appearing with their hands out. Thought about the kind of person he wanted to be, the kind of life he wanted to build with Margaret. "Because I want to know that everything I have, I earned. I want to know that my marriage isn't about money. That my children, if I have them, aren't raised as trust fund babies. I want a real life. Not a purchased one." Robert had nodded slowly. "I can respect that. But Mr. Whitmore, life can be unpredictable. Keep the trust information somewhere safe. You might change your mind someday. I won't, Harold said, but he kept the letter Thomas had left him. Kept it in his wallet, then later in his coat pocket, a reminder of the choice he'd made and the man he'd chosen to be. He never told Margaret about the money, not on their wedding day, not during their first year of marriage, not when they struggled to pay rent or when they ate the same meal 3 nights in a row because it was all they could afford. He told himself he was protecting her. If she didn't know, she couldn't accidentally reveal it. If she didn't know, she wouldn't wonder why they were struggling when they didn't have to. If she didn't know, their love would remain pure, untainted by the corruption of wealth. But the truth Harold barely admitted to himself, was that he was afraid. Afraid that if Margaret knew about the money, she'd see him differently. Afraid she'd question his judgment or his pride. Afraid the knowledge would change something fundamental between them. So he said nothing. And the years rolled on. 3 years into their marriage, Margaret got pregnant. Harold was 26, working as a full electrician now, making decent money. They'd moved into a small 2-bedroom apartment. Nothing fancy, but clean and safe. Dennis was born on a Tuesday morning in October. 7 pounds, 3 ounces, perfect in every way. Harold held his son for the first time and felt something shift in his chest. A fierce, protective love mixed with a gnawing fear. What if he couldn't provide? What if his pride hurt his child? For a moment, standing in that hospital room, he almost told Margaret about the trust, almost admitted that they didn't have to struggle, that their son could have everything he needed and more. But then he looked at Margaret's face, exhausted and radiant, and he thought, this is real. This moment, this love, this family we're building with our own hands, money would just complicate it. So, he kept his secret. They raised Dennis in that small apartment. Harold worked hard, picked up overtime whenever he could. Margaret stayed home with the baby, still taking in sewing work when Dennis napped. They clipped coupons, shopped at thrift stores, made every dollar stretch. Dennis grew up knowing that money was tight. He wore hand-me-down clothes and played with second-hand toys. When he wanted something, he had to earn it through chores and good grades. Harold and Margaret taught him the value of work, of saving, of being grateful for what you had. We may not be rich, Harold would tell his son, but we're rich in the things that matter. We have each other. Dennis seemed to understand when he was young. He was a good kid, helpful and kind, but as he got older, as he saw what other kids had, new bikes and video games and vacations, something began to shift. He started to resent their modest life. Started to ask why they couldn't have more. Because we live within our means, Harold would explain. We don't buy what we can't afford. But Tommy's dad makes the same as you, and they have a bigger house. Tommy's dad is also drowning in debt. We're not. Tommy's dad is also drowning. It was true. Harold and Margaret lived simply, but they were never in debt. They paid cash for everything. They saved. They built a small cushion for emergencies. By the standards of their community, they were doing fine. Not wealthy, but stable. But Dennis wanted more. And when he grew up and married Patricia, he found someone who wanted more too. Harold and Margaret met Patricia for the first time at Sunday dinner. Dennis was 28, working construction, living in a small apartment much like the one he'd grown up in. Patricia was 26, working as a receptionist, and within 5 minutes of meeting her, Margaret knew. "She's going to be trouble," Margaret whispered to Harold in the kitchen. "Give her a chance," Harold replied. "Dennis loves her." But Margaret was right. Patricia had grown up poor, truly poor, in a way that left scars. She'd clawed her way to middle class and was determined never to go back. Money wasn't just about comfort for her. It was about safety, about worth, about proving she was better than where she came from. The wedding was small. Patricia wanted something lavish, but there was no money for it. She settled for a simple ceremony with visible resentment. During the reception, she made comments about how Dennis's family was so humble and how she admired people who made do with so little. It wasn't a compliment. After the wedding, the cracks began to show. Patricia pushed Dennis to work more hours, take on extra jobs, make more money. She tracked every penny they spent. She compared their life to her co-workers' lives, to people she'd gone to high school with, always finding them lacking. And slowly, insidiously, she began to resent Harold and Margaret. "Your parents had the same opportunities everyone else did," she'd say to Dennis. "They just didn't take advantage of them. That's not your fault. You don't owe them anything." Harold and Margaret heard about these comments secondhand, through Dennis, who would repeat them with a weak smile and a shrug. "She's just stressed about money," he'd say. "She doesn't mean it." But she did mean it. And over the years, her resentment grew. When Nathan was born, Harold and Margaret offered to help. They'd take the bus across town twice a week to babysit, giving Patricia and Dennis a break. They'd bring groceries. Not expensive things, just basics. Rice and beans and pasta. Things from their own limited budget. Patricia accepted the help, but never with grace. "You really didn't have to bring anything," she'd say in a tone that implied she wished they hadn't, as if their modest contributions were an embarrassment rather than a gift. The real trouble started when Harold turned 72 and his back finally gave out. He'd been working as a maintenance man at the high school for decades, the same job he'd held since his 50s after leaving electrical work. It wasn't glamorous, but it was steady. Good benefits, decent pay. But one morning, he bent to pick up a box of supplies, and something in his lower back popped. The pain was instant and blinding. He collapsed, spent 3 days in the hospital. The doctors said his spine was deteriorating. Arthritis and age compounding decades of hard physical labor. "You need to retire," the doctor told him. "Your working days are over." At 72, Harold went on Social Security. Margaret was already on it, her cleaning jobs long behind her. Together, they collected just under $1,000 a month. Their rent was $850. They made it work. They always made it work. But it was tighter than ever. Dennis and Patricia knew they were struggling. Harold had mentioned, casually, that they might need to move to a cheaper apartment. That's when Patricia made her offer. "Come live with us. We have a basement." Harold had hesitated. "We don't want to be a burden." "You won't be," Patricia said with that smile that never reached her eyes. "Family takes care of family." So they moved into the basement, and for the first few months, it seemed okay. Patricia was distant, but not cruel. Dennis was busy, but not unkind. They had a roof over their heads, a place to sleep. It was enough. But then Patricia started tallying costs. She'd leave notes on the kitchen counter. "Electric bill was up $15 this month. Please be mindful of lights left on." Or, "Hot water usage has increased significantly. Please limit showers to 5 minutes." Harold and Margaret started bathing every other day. They'd use the bathroom upstairs as little as possible. They'd go to the library during the day, just to avoid using electricity in the basement. Patricia noticed and approved. See? This is what I mean about being mindful. We all have to pitch in. Except Harold and Margaret were the only ones pitching in. They cooked, cleaned, babysat, and asked for nothing. Patricia contributed nothing but complaints. The cruelty escalated slowly. First, it was comments about the food they ate. Did you eat the last of the bread? That was for Nathan's lunch. Then it was about space. We need the basement. You're taking up valuable square footage. Then it was about their very existence. People are asking questions. My co-workers want to know why my in-laws live in my basement. It's embarrassing. Dennis would occasionally defend them. Weakly. Mom and Dad aren't that bad. They help out a lot. But Patricia would shut him down. They're using our resources. Every month they stay is a month we can't rent the basement out. That's money we're losing. She'd calculated it. Down to the penny. What they could charge for a furnished basement apartment. What they were losing by letting Harold and Margaret stay. In her mind, his parents weren't family. They were missed revenue. The moment that broke Harold's heart came about 4 years into living there. It was winter. Cold, like it always was in the basement. Margaret had been coughing for weeks. Harold asked Dennis if they could turn up the heat. I'll ask Patricia, Dennis said. That night, Patricia came down to the basement. The thermostat is set at 64. That's a reasonable temperature. If you're cold, wear more layers. Margaret is sick, Harold said. She needs warmth. Then maybe she needs to see a doctor. We can't afford a doctor. Patricia's expression hardened. That's not my problem. You chose to live on Social Security. You chose not to save for retirement. Those are your choices, not mine. Harold felt something inside him snap. We raised Dennis. We gave him everything. We worked ourselves to the bone. And you stand there and tell me our poverty is our choice. It is, Patricia said coldly. You could have made different decisions, better decisions. Instead, you settled for mediocrity, and now you expect us to support you. She turned and walked up the stairs. Dennis, who'd been standing in the doorway, wouldn't meet Harold's eyes. He just followed his wife up and closed the door. Margaret coughed all night. Harold held her, trying to share his body heat, and for the first time in 43 years, he thought about the money, the millions sitting in trust. Growing, waiting, he could end this. Right now, with one phone call, he could give Margaret the warmth and care she deserved, could give them both dignity and independence. But something held him back. Pride, maybe, or principle, or the fear that claiming the money now would mean admitting his entire adult life had been a mistake. So he said nothing. And Margaret coughed. And the basement stayed cold, while Harold and Margaret suffered in silence. 734 miles away in Boston, Richard Caldwell sat in the law office his father Robert had founded. Richard had taken over the practice when his father retired 10 years earlier, inheriting not just clients, but also the peculiar case of Harold Whitmore. The Whitmore Trust had been Richard's father's obsession for decades, a $47 million estate that had grown to over $200 million, sitting untouched because the beneficiary had walked away and never looked back. It's the strangest thing I've ever seen, Robert used to tell his son. A man who inherited a fortune and just left. No contact, no claims, nothing. I've sent letters to every address we had. All returned. I've hired investigators. They find nothing. It's like Harold Whitmore vanished. Maybe he's dead, Richard had suggested. Maybe. But I can't confirm that. And until I do, The trust continues. When Robert retired, he passed the file to Richard with a single instruction. Keep looking. A man who turns down $47 million is either a fool or a saint. Either way, his story deserves an ending. So Richard kept looking. He hired new investigators, searched databases, followed paper trails that led nowhere. For years, nothing. Harold and Margaret had left Boston in the early 70s and seemingly disappeared into America's vast working class. Two more people among millions, invisible and forgotten. But Richard was persistent. And in late 2012, he finally caught a break. A routine cross-reference search flagged a Social Security record. Harold Whitmore, age 79, currently receiving benefits, last known address in Millbrook. The address was 7 years old, but it was something. Richard's hands trembled as he dialed the number associated with the address. It rang 6 times, then a woman answered. Hello, yes. Hello. I'm looking for Harold Whitmore. Who? Harold Whitmore. This number was listed as his contact. The woman laughed. Oh, you mean the old guy who used to rent the basement? He moved out years ago. Don't know where he went. Richard's heart sank. Do you have any idea where I might find him? Nope. Try the church, maybe. Those types usually end up at churches. She hung up. Richard sat back in his chair, staring at the file. $207 million, and the man it belonged to was homeless or close to it, renting basements and disappearing. He made a decision. He'd go to Millbrook himself. He'd knock on doors, ask questions, find Harold Whitmore, even if it took months, because his father was right. This story deserved an ending. But first, he needed to verify that Harold was still alive. He called the Social Security Administration, pulled some strings, called in some favors. 3 days later, he had confirmation. Harold Whitmore was alive, still receiving benefits, still in the system. Richard booked a flight to the nearest airport to Millbrook, rented a car, drove into the small town on a cold January morning, just days after Harold and Margaret had been thrown out of Dennis's house. He started at the town hall, asking about Harold Whitmore. No one knew him. He tried the local diner, the grocery store, the post office. Finally, an older woman at the library remembered something. I think there was a Harold doing maintenance at the high school, retired years back though, don't know where he ended up. Richard went to the high school. The current maintenance supervisor vaguely remembered Harold, but had no contact information. Nice guy though, real quiet, kept to himself, dead end after dead end. Richard spent 3 days in Millbrook, staying at the town's only motel, eating at the same diner, asking everyone he met if they knew Harold Whitmore. On the 4th day, he was about to give up when he stopped for coffee at the church. First Baptist. There was a community board in the entryway, covered with flyers and announcements. And there, pinned among the notices, was a sign-up sheet for volunteers at the church's homeless shelter program. He found Louise in the church office. I'm looking for someone, Richard said. An elderly man named Harold Whitmore. I have important information for him regarding an inheritance. Louise's expression shifted. She knew that name. Are you a lawyer? She asked carefully. I am. Richard Caldwell, from Boston. This is legitimate. I've been searching for Mr. Whitmore for years. Louise studied him for a long moment. Then she made a decision. Wait here. She returned 5 minutes later with Harold. The man who walked into that church office was nothing like Richard had imagined. He'd pictured someone eccentric, maybe paranoid, someone who'd run from wealth for strange reasons. Instead, he saw a dignified elderly man, in worn but clean clothes, standing straight, despite obvious pain, eyes clear and intelligent. "Mr. Whitmore?" Richard asked. "That's me. My name is Richard Caldwell. My father, Robert Caldwell, handled your Uncle Thomas's estate." Harold's face remained impassive, but Richard saw his hand move instinctively to his coat pocket, where Richard would later learn he kept Thomas's letter. "I know who you are," Harold said quietly. "Then you know why I'm here. I can guess." Richard opened his briefcase and pulled out the file. "Mr. Whitmore, you have an inheritance waiting for you. It's been in trust for 43 years. With careful investment and compound interest, it's now worth approximately $207 million. Louise gasped. Harold didn't move. "I know," Harold said simply. "You knew? I've always known. I chose not to claim it. Why?" Harold looked at Richard for a long moment. Then he said the words that would stay with Richard for the rest of his career. "Because I wanted to know that my life meant something beyond money, that my marriage was real, that I was worthy without wealth. And now," Richard asked gently. Harold's jaw tightened. "Now I'm 79 years old. My wife is sleeping on a church floor because our son threw us out, and my pride almost killed us both." He met Richard's eyes. "Now, I'm ready to claim what's mine. Not for me, but for her, for Margaret. She deserves better than what my principles gave her." Richard nodded slowly. "Then, let's make that happen." And in that moment, in a small church office in a forgotten town, the wheel began to turn. The past was about to collide with the present in ways no one could predict. Harold's 43-year-old decision was finally coming due. And soon, very soon, Dennis and Patricia would learn exactly what they'd thrown away. Richard Caldwell sat across from Harold and Margaret in the church conference room. Documents spread across the table like pieces of a puzzle that was finally coming together. Outside, the January wind howled against the windows, but inside, the air was thick with anticipation and decades of unspoken truth. "Before we proceed," Richard said, pulling out a leather folder, "I need to verify your identity beyond any doubt. There have been 3 attempts over the years by people claiming to be you, Mr. Whitmore. Fraudsters trying to access the trust." Harold nodded. "What do you need?" "Let's start with identification. Driver's license, social security card, birth certificate. If you have it." Harold reached into his worn wallet and pulled out his driver's license. The photo showed a younger version of himself, taken 7 years ago, before the basement, before the weight of those years had settled into his features. Margaret produced her documents as well, her hands trembling slightly as she laid them on the table. Richard examined each one carefully, cross-referencing against the files his father had maintained for over 4 decades. He pulled out a photograph from 1969, a young Harold Whitmore standing beside Thomas at some business function. The resemblance was unmistakable, despite the passage of time. "Next, I need to ask you some questions. Things only the real Harold Whitmore would know." For the next hour, Richard asked about Harold's childhood, about Thomas, about specific memories and details buried in legal documents from decades past. What was Thomas's middle name? What street did he live on? What was the name of his business partner? What year did Harold's parents die? Harold answered every question without hesitation. His memory sharp, despite his age. He described Thomas's study, the leather chair that creaked, the smell of pipe tobacco, the painting of a sailboat that hung behind the desk. Details no fraudster could have fabricated. Finally, Richard sat back. Whitmore. But for legal purposes, I need one more thing. DNA. From what? Harold asked. Your uncle, Thomas, was meticulous. Among his personal effects were items we've preserved. A hairbrush, a razor, items with genetic material. If your DNA matches, there's no question about your identity. Harold glanced at Margaret, who nodded. Do it, she said quietly. Let's finish this. Wills Sen. Wills Sen. Wills Sen. Wills Sen. Wills Sen. Richard pulled out a DNA collection kit and swabbed Harold's cheek. I'll have this couriered to a lab in Boston today. Rush processing means we'll have results in 72 hours, maybe less. And then? Margaret asked. Then, Richard said with a small smile, your lives change forever. Louise brought them lunch, sandwiches and soup from the church kitchen. She kept glancing at Harold and Margaret with a mixture of disbelief and wonder. $200 million. The homeless couple sleeping in her Sunday school room were worth $200 million. Does anyone else know? Louise asked Richard quietly in the hallway. Not yet, Richard replied. But they will. Word always gets out in cases like this. Should I be worried? For them, I mean, will people come after them? Richard's expression grew serious. Yes, absolutely. Once this becomes public knowledge, they'll need protection, security, legal representation, financial advisors they can trust. Right now, the best thing we can do is keep this quiet until the DNA results confirm everything. But keeping secrets in small towns is like trying to hold water in a sieve. It seeps out through the cracks, spreads in whispers, grows with each retelling. That afternoon, a volunteer at the church named Diane overheard Louise talking to Richard in the office. She didn't hear everything, just fragments. Inheritance, millions, Harold and Margaret. By evening, she'd mentioned it to her sister. By the next morning, her sister had mentioned it to a friend at the grocery store, and that friend happened to be Patricia's cousin, Janet. Janet called Patricia immediately. You need to hear this. It's about Dennis's parents. Patricia was at work, filing papers at the dental office, already irritated because Dennis had been moping around the house ever since they'd thrown out his parents. Nathan wouldn't stop crying. The neighbors were giving them looks. Even her boss had made a comment about family values. What about them? Patricia asked impatiently. Janet lowered her voice. Word is, there's a lawyer from Boston looking for them. Something about an inheritance. A big one. Like millions. Patricia's hand froze mid-file. What? Diane's sister heard it at the church. Apparently, this fancy lawyer showed up asking about Harold, saying something about $200 million. The phone nearly slipped from Patricia's hand. 200 million? That's what they're saying. I don't know if it's true, but if it is. Janet let the implication hang in the air. Patricia hung up without saying goodbye. Her mind raced. $200 million. Harold and Margaret, the old couple she'd just thrown into the street, the burden she'd complained about for 7 years, were worth $200 million. It couldn't be true. It had to be a mistake, some confusion, or exaggeration. Harold wore the same 3 shirts in rotation. Margaret's shoes were held together with tape. They ate leftovers and asked permission to shower. People with money didn't live like that. But what if it was true? Patricia grabbed her purse and left work without clocking out. She drove straight home, her mind spinning with calculations and possibilities. $200 million. A fraction of that would solve every problem they had. The mortgage, the credit cards, Nathan's future college fund, everything. She burst through the front door to find Dennis on the couch, staring at the television without really watching it. Nathan was at school. "We need to talk," Patricia said, her voice sharp with urgency. Dennis looked up. "About what?" "About your parents. About what we just did. Patricia, we've been over this. We needed the space. They have money, Dennis." He blinked. "What? Money?" "A lot of it. There's a lawyer from Boston looking for them. People are saying it's an inheritance worth $200 million. Dennis laughed. A hollow sound. "That's ridiculous. My parents don't have 2 cents to rub together. You know that better than anyone. What if it's true? What if your father had money this whole time and never told anyone? Why would he do that? I don't know." Patricia paced the living room. "But if it's true, Dennis, we just threw away our retirement. We just threw away Nathan's college fund. We just threw away everything because I wanted to rent out a basement for $600 a month." The weight of her words settled over them both. Dennis's face went pale. "Where are they now?" he asked, quietly. "The church. First Baptist." Dennis stood up. "We need to go there. We need to talk to them." "And say what?" "Sorry we threw you out, but we heard you're rich now." Nine. "I don't know," Dennis said, grabbing his jacket. "But we have to try." They arrived at First Baptist 20 minutes later, just as Richard Caldwell was leaving to courier the DNA sample to the lab. He was walking to his rental car when Patricia and Dennis intercepted him. "Excuse me," Patricia called out. "Are you the lawyer from Boston?" Richard turned, immediately wary. Years of legal work had taught him to recognize opportunists, and these two had the look of people who'd just caught the scent of money. "I am." "And you are?" "I'm Dennis Whitmore, Harold's son. This is my wife, Patricia." Richard's expression didn't change, but internally, he noted everything. The son who, according to Louise, had just evicted his elderly parents into a winter storm. The daughter-in-law who'd made their lives miserable for 7 years. "I see," Richard said coolly. "And what can I do for you?" "We need to see my father," Dennis said. "It's important. Family business. Your father is resting. He and your mother have been through quite an ordeal." Patricia stepped forward. "We know. That's why we're here. We want to apologize, to make things right." "How convenient," Richard said, making no effort to hide his skepticism. "You want to make things right the same day you learn about the inheritance." Dennis flinched. "It's not like that, isn't it?" Richard opened his car door. "Let me be very clear. Mr. Whitmore, your parents are my clients now. If they want to see you, they'll let you know. Until then, I'd appreciate it if you kept your distance." "You can't keep us from our own family," Patricia said, her voice rising. "Actually, I can. It's called respecting their wishes. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have important business to attend to." Richard drove away, leaving Dennis and Patricia standing in the parking lot. Patricia's face was red with anger and embarrassment. Dennis just looked sick. "This is bad," he whispered. "This is really bad. We need to see them," Patricia insisted. "We need to explain." "Explain what? That we only care now that there's money involved?" "Patricia, we threw them out. We made them sleep in a basement for 7 years. We treated them like servants. What explanation makes that okay? Patricia had no answer. For the first time in their marriage, she was confronted with the full weight of what she'd done. Not just the cruelty of it, but the stupidity. She'd pushed out the golden goose and slaughtered it. All for $600 a month in potential rental income. Inside the church, Harold and Margaret heard about Dennis and Patricia's visit from Louise. Harold's jaw tightened. Margaret just looked sad. They know, Margaret said softly. About the money. Of course they know, Harold replied bitterly. The only question is how fast they showed up after they found out. What do we do? Harold stood and walked to the window, looking out at the parking lot where his son had stood just minutes ago. Nothing. We do nothing. We wait for the DNA results. We handle the legal matters. And then we decide what kind of relationship, if any, we want with them. Harold, he's still our son. I know. Harold's voice cracked slightly. That's what makes it hurt so much. The next 48 hours passed in strange suspension. Harold and Margaret remained at the church, though Richard had offered to put them up in a hotel. We're fine here, Harold had said. These people helped us when no one else would. We're not abandoning them now. Richard returned to Boston to personally oversee the DNA processing, calling in every favor he had to expedite the results. Meanwhile, the rumors in Millbrook grew wilder by the hour. At the grocery store, people whispered that Harold had been a secret millionaire all along, hiding his wealth while living in a basement. At the diner, speculation ran that he'd won the lottery years ago and never told anyone. At the beauty salon, someone claimed he'd been a spy who'd embezzled government funds. The truth was somehow both more mundane and more extraordinary than any of the rumors. But nobody knew it yet. Dennis tried calling the church 3 times. Louise told him each time that Harold and Margaret didn't wish to speak with him. Patricia showed up in person, bringing flowers and a card with a handwritten apology. Louise accepted them but made no promises about delivery. I just want to talk to them, Patricia pleaded. Please. I know I made mistakes. I want to make it right. Louise, who'd seen the basement Harold and Margaret had lived in, who'd heard about the cold and the hunger and the cruelty, looked at Patricia with barely concealed disgust. You had 7 years to make it right. You chose different. On the 3rd day, Richard called. Harold answered the church office phone, his hand shaking. Mr. Whitmore, the results are in. The DNA is a perfect match. You are definitively Thomas Whitmore's nephew and sole heir. The trust is legally yours. Harold sat down heavily. Margaret, standing beside him, gripped his shoulder. What happens now? Harold asked. Now, we begin the transfer process. I'll need you to sign documents, establish accounts, meet with financial advisors. This will take several weeks to complete fully, but I can arrange for immediate access to funds if you need them. How much? I can wire $10 million to a local account within 24 hours. That should be sufficient for immediate needs while we work out the larger details. $10 million. The number was so absurd that Harold almost laughed. 3 days ago, he'd been worried about how to afford dinner. Now he was being offered $10 million as pocket money. Do it, he said. And Richard, thank you for not giving up on finding us. My father always said your story deserved an ending, Mr. Whitmore. I'm just glad it's a happy one. After hanging up, Harold turned to Margaret. She was crying, tears streaming down her face. But she was smiling too. It's real, she whispered. After all these years, it's finally real. Harold pulled her into his arms. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry I made you wait so long. Made you suffer so much. Hush, Margaret said. We're here now. That's what matters. Louise knocked on the doorframe. Sorry to interrupt, but there are people outside. Quite a few of them, actually. Harold and Margaret went to the window. In the parking lot, a small crowd had gathered. Some were curious onlookers. Others were reporters from the local paper, and even a television crew from the nearest city. And standing at the front, looking desperate and small, were Dennis and Patricia. How did the media find out? Margaret asked. Small towns, Louise said with a sigh. Can't keep anything quiet for long. Richard had warned Harold this would happen. Once the DNA results were confirmed, once the lawyers started filing paperwork, the story would leak. Elderly couple worth hundreds of millions discovered living homeless. It was the kind of human interest story that news outlets salivated over. We need to make a statement, Harold said, before this gets out of control. He walked outside, Margaret beside him, Louise following protectively. The crowd pressed forward, cameras flashing, voices calling out questions. Mr. Whitmore, is it true? You're worth $200 million. How long have you known about the inheritance? Why were you living in your son's basement? Harold raised his hand. And surprisingly, the crowd quieted. My name is Harold Whitmore, he began, his voice steady despite his nerves. 43 years ago, I inherited a substantial sum from my uncle. I chose not to claim it because I wanted to build a life based on my own work, my own merit. That was my choice, and I don't regret it. He paused, looking directly at the cameras. What I do regret is letting my pride hurt the woman I love. My wife, Margaret, deserved better than the life my principles gave her. So I'm claiming the inheritance now. Not for myself, but for her, and for everyone who's ever been forgotten or thrown away because they didn't have money. A reporter called out, What about your son? Is it true he evicted you? Harold's expression hardened. My son made his choices. Now, I'll make mine. He turned and walked back into the church, Margaret beside him, leaving the crowd buzzing with speculation and excitement. Dennis watched from the back of the crowd, his face ashen. Patricia stood beside him, calculating even in her desperation. We need a lawyer, she hissed. If that's his inheritance, you might have a legal claim. Family law, filial responsibility. Stop, Dennis said quietly. Just stop. But Dennis, he's right. Dennis's voice broke. We made our choices. We don't get to undo them just because money showed up. For the first time in their marriage, Patricia saw something in Dennis she'd never seen before. Shame so profound it bordered on self-loathing. And for just a moment, she felt it too. Not guilt about what they'd done to Harold and Margaret specifically, but about who they'd become in the process. People who measured worth in dollars, who treated family as commodities, who'd thrown away love for the promise of $600 a month. That night, Dennis wrote a letter. Not an email, not a text, but a real letter on paper, written in his own hand. It took him 4 hours and 7 drafts to get it right. Dad and Mom, I don't expect you to forgive me. I don't expect you to even read this. But I need to say it anyway. I failed you. Not just last week when I threw you out, but for 7 years before that. I let Patricia treat you terribly, and I did nothing to stop it. I watched you sleep in my basement, eat my scraps, and beg for basic dignity, and I told myself it was okay because we were giving you shelter. But we weren't giving you shelter. We were taking your dignity. I was so worried about money, about keeping up, about proving I was better than my raising, that I forgot what you taught me. That character matters more than comfort. That love isn't transactional. That family means showing up, especially when it's hard. I don't want your money. I don't want anything except the chance to be the son you deserved all along. But I know I don't deserve that chance. So I'll understand if you never want to see me again. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. Dennis. He drove to the church at midnight and slipped the letter under the office door. Then he sat in his car in the empty parking lot and cried like he hadn't cried since he was a child. Inside the church, Harold found the letter at 6 in the morning. He read it twice, then handed it to Margaret. She read it with tears in her eyes. "What do you want to do?" she asked. Harold was quiet for a long time. "I don't know. I'm so angry at him, Margaret. So hurt. But he's still our son." "He is," Margaret agreed. "And anger and love aren't mutually exclusive. We can be both." Margaret agreed. Enova. And agreed. Do we forgive him? Margaret thought about that. Eventually, maybe. But forgiveness isn't the same as forgetting. And it's not the same as letting them back into our lives like nothing happened. Harold nodded slowly. "So, what's the middle ground?" "We let him try," Margaret said. "We don't make it easy. We don't pretend the past 7 years didn't happen. But we give him the chance to prove he's really changed, not just acting different because money showed up." It was the most difficult conversation they'd had in 56 years of marriage. Because the easy path would have been to either shut Dennis out completely or to let him back in unconditionally. The hard path was the middle one. The path that required boundaries and accountability, and the painful work of rebuilding trust that had been shattered. Over the next week, Richard returned to Millbrook with a team of financial advisors, accountants, and lawyers. They set up temporary offices in a conference room at the town's only hotel. Harold and Margaret met with them daily, signing documents, making decisions, learning about wealth management and estate planning and tax strategies. It was overwhelming, exhausting. Harold would return to the church each evening, with his head spinning, from numbers and legal terminology he barely understood. But Richard was patient. "You don't need to understand everything right now," he said. "That's why you have advisors, people you can trust to guide you. Right now, the most important thing is deciding what you want." "What we want," Harold repeated. "Yes. This is your money, Mr. Whitmore. Not mine. Not the advisors. Not anyone else's. What do you want to do with it?" Harold and Margaret talked long into the nights about that question. They'd lived so long with so little that the idea of having everything was almost paralyzing. "I want you to be warm," Harold said. "I want you to sleep in a real bed. I want you to never worry about money again." "I want the same for you," Margaret replied. "But I want more than that too. I want this money to mean something, to do something good." They decided on a house first. Not a mansion, nothing ostentatious, just a comfortable 4-bedroom home on the outskirts of town. Big enough for them, with extra room for guests. A real kitchen, a fireplace. Central heating that worked. They paid cash. $375,000, which was expensive for Millbrook, but barely a drop in their bucket. They moved in 3 weeks after the DNA results came back, their few belongings looking absurdly small in the empty rooms. Louise and the church volunteers helped them shop for furniture. Harold and Margaret, who'd lived with so little for so long, were overwhelmed by the choices. They bought practical things, sturdy furniture that would last. Nothing fancy or showy. You could have a plasma television, Louise pointed out. We barely watch TV. Margaret replied. Why do we need a big one? It was strange. Being rich, but not thinking rich. Having the money to buy anything, but not wanting most things. Harold and Margaret had spent their entire lives training themselves to live without. And that mindset didn't disappear just because their bank account had 9 figures in it now. News of their story spread beyond Millbrook. National outlets picked it up. Elderly couple discovers fortune after being evicted by son. The story had everything. Wealth, family drama, redemption. Harold and Margaret declined most interview requests. But the attention was inescapable. People started showing up at their new house. Distant relatives Harold barely remembered claiming they'd always been close. Charities requesting donations. Investment opportunities and business proposals. Even a few marriage proposals for Margaret. From men who apparently didn't care that she was 76 and already married. Richard arranged for security. Nothing intrusive. Just someone to screen visitors and phone calls. To protect Harold and Margaret from the inevitable onslaught of people trying to take advantage. This is the hard part, Richard warned them. Everyone will want something from you now. You need to be very careful about who you trust. But Harold and Margaret had already decided who they could trust. Louise, who'd helped them when they had nothing. The church volunteers who'd given freely without expecting anything in return. The social worker, Jennifer, who'd treated them with dignity even when they were homeless. These were the people they kept close. Everyone else, including their own son, would have to prove themselves. Dennis continued to write letters. One every week. Slipped under the door of Harold and Margaret's new house. He never asked for money, never requested anything, just apologized. Over and over, in different ways. Patricia stopped coming around after the first month. She'd tried a few more times to see Harold and Margaret, always with Nathan in tow, using the child as leverage. But Margaret, who loved her grandson fiercely, "You don't get to use that boy as a bargaining chip," Margaret told Patricia through the door. "If you want to see us, you come alone, and you come honest." Patricia never came back. But Dennis kept writing, kept trying, and slowly, painfully, Harold and Margaret began to soften. Not forgive, not yet, but soften. Because despite everything, despite the hurt and the anger and the betrayal, he was still their son. And love, real love, doesn't disappear just because someone fails you. It just becomes more complicated. 3 months after the DNA results came back, Harold and Margaret invited Dennis to lunch. Just lunch. At a restaurant in town, neutral territory. No Patricia, no Nathan. Just the 3 of them. Dennis arrived early, nervous, wearing his best shirt. When Harold and Margaret walked in, he stood so fast he nearly knocked over his chair. "Mom, Dad," his voice cracked. They sat down, ordered coffee, and for the first time in years, really talked. Not about money, not about the past 7 years, just talked. About life. About memories. About the man Dennis used to be before Patricia's influence and financial stress had twisted him into someone else. It wasn't reconciliation, not yet. But it was a start. And for Harold and Margaret, who'd learned over a lifetime that good things take time, a start was enough. 6 months after Richard Caldwell first walked into that church office, Harold and Margaret sat in a lawyer's conference room, surrounded by documents. that would change not just their lives, but the lives of thousands they'd never meet. The papers spread across the mahogany table outlined the creation of the Whitmore Foundation, a charitable organization dedicated to helping homeless elderly individuals and families. "Are you certain about this?" Richard asked. He'd watched Harold and Margaret over the past months, seen how they handled sudden wealth with the same grace they'd handled poverty. "You're committing $50 million to the Foundation's endowment. That's a substantial amount." Harold looked at Margaret, who nodded. "We're certain," Harold said. "We know what it's like to be old and forgotten, to be thrown away by people who should care. If we can prevent even one person from going through what we did, then it's worth every penny." Margaret leaned forward, her voice steady and clear. "Money didn't make us who we are, Richard. 56 years of living did that. This foundation, it's not charity, it's justice. It's saying that everyone deserves dignity." The Whitmore Foundation launched on a crisp October morning, exactly 1 year after Harold and Margaret had been thrown out of Dennis's basement. The timing was intentional. They wanted to remember where they'd come from. Wanted that cold night to fuel their mission rather than embitter it. Louise became the Foundation's executive director, earning a salary 3 times what she'd made at the church. She cried when Harold offered her the position. "I don't have experience running a foundation," she'd protested. "You have something better," Margaret replied. "You have heart, and you know what it's like to see people at their lowest and still treat them with respect." The Foundation's headquarters occupied a renovated building on Main Street, the old furniture store that had sat empty for 5 years. Harold and Margaret could have chosen something grander, something in a bigger city with more prestige. But they wanted it here, in Millbrook, the town that had witnessed both their humiliation and their redemption. The building housed offices, a commercial kitchen, shower facilities, a clothing bank, and a computer lab where elderly clients could search for jobs or housing, or simply stay connected with family. But it wasn't a shelter. Harold and Margaret were adamant about that distinction. "We're not warehousing people," Harold explained during the opening ceremony, standing before a crowd of 200 community members, reporters, and dignitaries. "We're giving them tools and dignity and time. Time to heal, time to plan, time to rebuild." The services were comprehensive. Emergency housing assistance for those facing eviction, job training and placement for those who could still work, medical care coordination for those dealing with health issues, legal aid for navigating systems designed to intimidate, and most importantly, a safe place where someone would listen without judgment, where being old and poor wasn't treated as a moral failing. Within the first month, the Foundation helped 17 families. By the 3rd month, that number had grown to 63. Stories began to emerge, stories that echoed Harold and Margaret's own journey. There was Donald, 72, a former teacher who'd been living in his car after his daughter kicked him out for being too much trouble. The Foundation helped him find senior housing and reconnected him with support services he didn't know existed. There was Ruth, 68, who'd been sleeping on friends' couches for 2 years after her apartment building was condemned. The Foundation's housing specialists found her a subsidized apartment and furnished it with donated items. There was Michael and June, a couple in their 80s, facing eviction after their fixed income couldn't keep up with rising rent. The Foundation negotiated with their landlord, paid 3 months back rent, and connected them with rent assistance programs. Each story was different, but they all shared one common thread. Someone had cared when no one else did. Someone had seen them as human beings worthy of help, not as burdens to be discarded. Harold and Margaret visited the foundation every day. Not as wealthy benefactors making ceremonial appearances, but as volunteers. They'd serve lunch in the kitchen, sit and talk with clients, share their own story when asked. They never positioned themselves above anyone. They'd been there, in that darkness, and they wanted people to know they understood. One afternoon, a woman in her 70s sat across from Margaret in the foundation's common area. Her name was Alice, and she'd been living in her son's garage for 3 years, sleeping on a cot next to the lawnmower, forbidden from entering the main house. "How do you do it?" Alice asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "How do you forgive them? Your son, after what he did." Margaret was quiet for a long moment. "Forgiveness isn't something that happens all at once," she finally said. "It's not a switch you flip. It's more like slowly letting go of a stone you've been carrying. Some days it feels lighter. Some days it feels heavier. But you keep trying because holding on to hate hurts you more than it hurts them. Do you see him? Your son? Sometimes. We have lunch once a month. He's trying to be better. Whether that's genuine or just because he feels guilty, I don't know yet. But we're giving him the chance to show us." Alice's eyes filled with tears. "I don't know if I can do that." "They can, some. I don't know if I can do that." "Then don't," Margaret said simply. "Not everyone deserves forgiveness, Alice, and you don't owe it to anyone. What you do owe yourself is peace, however that looks for you." It was conversations like these, raw and honest and healing, that made the foundation more than just a service provider. It became a community, a place where people who'd been invisible suddenly mattered again. But not everyone celebrated the foundation's success. Patricia certainly didn't. While Harold and Margaret built their legacy of compassion, Patricia's world was crumbling. The story of what she'd done to her in-laws had spread through Millbrook like wildfire. At first, people had been curious, even sympathetic. Poor Patricia, married to the son of secret millionaires, not knowing what she had. But as more details emerged, as people learned about the 7 years of cruelty, the cold basement, the trash bags, the eviction into 18-degree weather, sympathy turned to disgust. The dental office where Patricia worked started losing patience. People didn't want to be treated by someone who'd treated elderly family members so callously. Her boss, Dr. Morrison, called her into his office 3 months after the story broke. "Patricia, I'm going to have to let you go," he said, not meeting her eyes. "What? Why? I haven't done anything wrong here." "You've done nothing wrong professionally, Doctor," Morrison agreed. "But this is a small town. People talk. And right now, having you as the face of this practice is costing us business. That's not fair. What I did in my personal life, you threw elderly people into the street in winter." Dr. Morrison interrupted, his voice hard. "People who'd helped raise your son, who'd lived with you for 7 years. That's not just personal, Patricia. That's character. And people don't want someone with that kind of character touching their teeth." Patricia was fired that day. She applied to every dental office within 30 miles. None of them would hire her. The story had spread too far. She was damaged goods, a cautionary tale. The woman who threw away $200 million and her humanity in the process. Dennis fared slightly better, but not much. His construction crew knew his story, had known Harold during his maintenance years at the high school. They'd seen how Dennis's father had worked hard, stayed humble, never complained. And they'd heard about the basement, the cold, the cruelty. "Your dad's a good man," his foreman told him one afternoon. "Better than you deserved." It wasn't said with malice, just fact. And Dennis couldn't argue because it was true. His relationship with Patricia deteriorated rapidly. The stress of unemployment, the shame of public judgment, and the weight of what they'd done created cracks that widened into chasms. They fought constantly, each blaming the other for their situation. "This is your fault," Patricia would scream. "You and your pathetic family. If your father hadn't been such a miser, hiding money like some kind of crazy person." "Don't you dare," Dennis would shout back. "My father lived the way he believed was right. You're the one who made their lives hell. You're the reason we're in this mess." Nathan, now 9 years old, watched his parents destroy each other. He'd started having nightmares, crying for his grandparents, asking questions his parents couldn't answer. "Why did you make Grandma and Grandpa leave? Why don't they live with us anymore? Why does everyone at school say mean things about Mom and Dad?" It was Nathan who finally broke Dennis completely. One night, after another screaming match between his parents, the boy packed a small backpack and tried to run away. Dennis found him at the end of the driveway, sitting on the curb in the dark. "Where are you going, buddy?" Dennis asked, sitting beside his son. "To find Grandma and Grandpa," Nathan said, tears streaming down his face. "I want to live with them. They were never mean. They never yelled. They always listened to me." Dennis pulled his son close, his own tears falling. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry, Nathan. I messed up so bad. Why did you make them leave?" "Because I was scared and stupid, and I listened to the wrong voice. I thought money was more important than family. I was wrong. Can we fix it?" Dennis looked at his 9-year-old son, this beautiful child who still believed broken things could be repaired, and he didn't know how to answer. Could they fix it? He'd been trying for months, writing letters, showing up to those monthly lunches, doing everything his parents asked. But he could still see the hurt in their eyes, the wariness in how they held themselves around him. "I don't know," Dennis admitted, "but I'm going to keep trying." 2 weeks later, Patricia filed for divorce. She moved out, taking nothing but her clothes and her bitterness. She left Millbrook entirely, relocating to a city 3 hours away where no one knew her story. Dennis heard she'd eventually found work as a receptionist at a car dealership, using her maiden name, starting over with a carefully constructed past that didn't include throwing elderly in-laws into the street. Dennis stayed in Millbrook with Nathan. It was harder, being a single parent in a town that judged him, but he refused to run. He'd run from enough, avoided enough consequences. It was time to face what he'd done and who he'd become. He attended every foundation event, not as family but as a volunteer. He'd show up early, stay late, do whatever needed doing, cleaning bathrooms, hauling supplies, setting up chairs, the grunt work no one else wanted. He never approached his parents during these events, never tried to leverage his presence for attention. He just worked. Harold and Margaret noticed. How could they not? Their son, working quietly in the background, never asking for recognition, never seeking forgiveness he hadn't earned. It didn't erase the past, but it was something. A start. One evening, after a foundation fundraising dinner, Harold approached Dennis as he was folding tables. "You don't have to do this," Harold said. Dennis looked up. "I know, but I want to. I need to." "Why?" "Because I'm trying to understand what you were trying to teach me my whole life. That work matters. That service matters. That showing up matters." Dennis's voice cracked. "I'm trying to be the man you raised me to be, instead of the man I became." Harold was quiet for a long moment. "It's going to take time, Dennis. You hurt us deeply. Your mother, especially. I know, but," Harold continued, "I see you trying. We both do. And that counts for something. It wasn't forgiveness. Not yet. But it was acknowledgement. And for Dennis, who'd spent months feeling invisible in his parents' presence, it felt like sunlight breaking through clouds. The Foundation's first anniversary celebration was held in the town square. 500 people attended, far more than could fit in the Foundation building. There were speeches from people the Foundation had helped, performances from a local choir, and a moment of silence for those who'd died, homeless and forgotten. Harold and Margaret stood on the platform, overwhelmed by the turnout. They'd expected maybe 50 people. Instead, the square was packed, people standing shoulder to shoulder, united by a shared belief that elderly people deserved dignity. Louise stepped to the microphone first. A year ago, two people who'd been forgotten by their own family chose not to become bitter. They chose not to seek revenge. They chose, instead, to make sure no one else would have to experience what they experienced. Harold and Margaret Whitmore didn't just inherit money. They inherited a choice about what kind of people they wanted to be. And they chose compassion. The crowd applauded. Harold and Margaret stepped forward, Harold helping Margaret up the small stairs to the microphone. He'd written a speech, had it folded in his pocket, but standing there looking at all those faces, he realized he didn't need it. "Margaret and I spent most of our lives poor," Harold began, his voice carrying across the square. "We worked hard, lived simply, and tried to be good people. We thought that would be enough. And in some ways, it was. We had each other. We had love. We had meaning." He paused, his hand finding Margaret's. "But we also had suffering we didn't need to have. We were thrown away by people who should have valued us. We were made to feel like burdens simply because we were old and didn't have money. And that's wrong. That's fundamentally, deeply wrong." Margaret squeezed his hand, and he continued. "This foundation exists because no one should have to choose between their dignity and a roof over their head. No one should be discarded because they're no longer young or productive or profitable. We're not just helping people with housing or food or medical care, though we're doing that too. We're saying, loudly and clearly, that every person has value, every life matters, every elder deserves respect." The crowd erupted in applause. People were crying, including Dennis, who stood at the back of the crowd with Nathan on his shoulders. Margaret stepped to the microphone next. She'd never been comfortable with public speaking, but her voice was steady. "Someone once asked me how we could forgive what was done to us. The truth is, I don't know if we have completely. Forgiveness is complicated, but what I do know is this: we can't change the past. We can only choose what we do with the present." She looked directly at Dennis, standing in the crowd. "We choose compassion over bitterness. We choose purpose over revenge. We choose to build something that outlasts our hurt. And we choose to believe that people can change if they're willing to do the work." It was the closest thing to forgiveness she'd offered publicly. Dennis felt it like a hand reaching across a chasm, not quite bridging the gap but acknowledging it could be bridged someday. After the speeches, people lined up to share their stories. Some had been helped by the foundation. Others just wanted to thank Harold and Margaret for proving that wealth didn't have to corrupt, that success could be measured in service rather than possessions. An elderly man named George, who'd been homeless for 6 years before the foundation helped him, stood with tears streaming down his face. "You saved my life," he told Harold. "Not just physically, though you did that too, but you saved my dignity. You made me feel human again." Harold embraced him. "You've always been human, George. Always been worthy. We just made sure you knew it." As the sun set over Millbrook's town square, casting everything in golden light, Harold and Margaret stood surrounded by the community they'd built. Not with money, though money had helped, but with intentionality and grace, and the stubborn belief that good people could do good things. Louise approached them with a folder. "I wanted to show you this before it goes public tomorrow. The Foundation's first-year impact report." Harold opened it, Margaret reading over his shoulder. The numbers were staggering. 147 families helped, 92 people housed, 361 medical appointments coordinated, thousands of meals served, countless moments of dignity restored. But it was the testimonials that made Margaret cry. Pages of handwritten notes from people whose lives had been changed. "You gave me back my independence. You treated me like I mattered. You saw me when everyone else looked away. Because of you, I have hope again." Harold closed the folder carefully. "It's not enough," he said. Louise blinked. "What? 147 families in 1 year in one small town. How many more are out there? How many George? How many Alices? How many people sleeping in cars or basements or on friends' couches because they've been thrown away?" "Thousands," Louise said quietly. "Probably millions across the country." "Then we need to do more," Margaret said. "We need to expand. Other towns, other cities. We need to turn this into a movement. Over the next year." That's exactly what they did. The Whitmore Foundation expanded to 3 additional locations in neighboring towns. They established partnerships with existing homeless services, training staff on elderly-specific needs. They lobbied local governments to change policies that discriminated against older renters. They created an awareness campaign about elder poverty and homelessness, telling stories the media usually ignored. Harold and Margaret poured themselves into the work. Not just their money, though they invested another $30 million over that second year, but their time, their energy, their voices. They spoke at conferences, gave interviews, wrote op-eds. They became advocates, activists, the faces of a movement that said elderly lives mattered. They also bought a modest home for Dennis and Nathan. Not a mansion, just a comfortable 3-bedroom house in a good school district. They paid off Dennis's debts and set up a college fund for Nathan. But they made it clear this wasn't forgiveness, and it certainly wasn't a reward. "This is for Nathan," Margaret told Dennis when she handed him the deed. "Every child deserves stability. That boy has been through enough turmoil. This is us making sure he has a foundation, literally and figuratively." Dennis had cried, accepting the gift with trembling hands. "I don't deserve this." "You're right," Harold said bluntly. "You don't, but Nathan does. And maybe having stability will help you become the father he deserves." The relationship between Harold, Margaret, and Dennis remained complicated. They saw each other regularly now, weekly dinners that were sometimes easy and sometimes painfully awkward. Dennis continued volunteering at the foundation, had become one of their most reliable workers. He'd even started speaking at events, sharing his story as a cautionary tale. "I had parents who loved me," he'd say to audiences. "Parents who sacrificed everything to raise me right. And when they needed me, I threw them away because my wife convinced me they were worthless without money. I believed her because it was easier than standing up to her. I'm not telling you this story for sympathy. I'm telling it as a warning. This is who you become when you value dollars over dignity. Don't be me. It was painful honesty, the kind that made people uncomfortable. But it was also effective. Several people came forward after Dennis's speeches to say they'd been treating their own elderly parents poorly and were going to change. Maybe that's my penance, Dennis told Harold after one such speech. If I can prevent even one person from making my mistake, maybe I can live with what I did. Penance isn't about making yourself feel better, Harold replied. It's about actually changing, being better. Not for redemption, but because it's right. Am I changing? Dennis asked. Honestly, Dad, am I? Harold considered the question seriously. You're trying. That's more than you were doing 2 years ago. It wasn't the absolution Dennis wanted, but it was honest. And increasingly, Harold found he could be in the same room with his son without feeling overwhelming anger. The hurt was still there, probably always would be, but it had softened into something more, like sad acceptance. Margaret was slower to forgive. She was cordial with Dennis, kind even, but there was a distance that hadn't existed before the basement years. Some wounds, Harold realized, cut too deep to fully heal. You could function with the scar, but the tissue was never quite the same. On the second anniversary of their eviction, Harold and Margaret did something unusual. They returned to the church where they'd first found shelter, where Louise had brought them coffee and asked no questions. They requested to spend the night in that same Sunday school room, sleeping on thin mattresses with donated blankets. Why would you want to do that? Louise asked, confused. Because we need to remember, Margaret explained. We need to remember what it felt like, how scared we were, how uncertain. If we forget that, we forget why we're doing all this. So they spent the night on the floor, their old bones protesting, the cold seeping in despite the church's heat. And in the morning, they woke grateful, not just for the wealth that had changed their circumstances, but for the poverty that had shaped their character. We're lucky, Harold said as they folded the blankets. Margaret raised an eyebrow. Lucky to sleep on the floor at our age. Lucky to understand what it means to have nothing. Lucky to know that our worth isn't tied to our bank account. Lucky to have each other through all of it. Margaret smiled. That same smile that had captured his heart 58 years ago. You're right. We are lucky. But we also worked for this. Not the money. The inheritance was chance. But the people we are. The life we built. The love we protected. That was work. Every single day. They left the church hand in hand, the morning sun warming their faces. They had a foundation meeting at 9, lunch with Dennis and Nathan at noon, and an interview with a national magazine at 3. Their calendar was full, their purpose clear, their legacy being written in real time. But more than any of that, they had each other. Still together after 58 years, after poverty and wealth, after betrayal and redemption, after every test life could throw at them. They'd survived, not because money saved them, but because they'd built something money couldn't buy. A love based on mutual respect, shared values, and the commitment to be better tomorrow than they were today. 3 years after that frozen January night, Harold was 82 and Margaret was 79. The foundation had expanded to 12 locations across 3 states. They'd helped over 2,000 families. Their model was being studied by social workers and policymakers across the country. The Whitmore name had become synonymous with elder advocacy and dignified service. They'd given away over $90 million to various causes, most focused on elderly welfare but some supporting education, healthcare, and community development. They lived comfortably but not extravagantly in their modest 4-bedroom home. They drove a 6-year-old sedan. They still clipped coupons, more from habit than necessity. "People think we're crazy," Margaret said one evening as they sat on their back porch watching the sunset. "Rich people who live like they're not rich. Let them think what they want." Harold replied, "We know who we are." Nathan, now 12, came bursting through the back door. He spent every weekend with his grandparents, had essentially moved in, though Dennis technically had custody. The relationship between father and son was healing slowly. But Nathan gravitated toward Harold and Margaret's stability. "Grandpa, I finished the essay you wanted me to write." Harold smiled. He'd asked Nathan to write about what wealth meant, expected a 12-year-old's perspective on money and possessions. What Nathan handed him was better. Harold read aloud, "My grandparents are the richest people I know, not because they have money, though they do, but because they have something money can't buy. They have integrity. They lived in a cold basement for 7 years and never complained. They were thrown out into the snow and didn't become mean. They could have spent their fortune on mansions and cars, but instead they helped people everyone else forgot about. Real wealth isn't what you have. It's what you give away and who you choose to be when no one's watching. My grandparents taught me that. I hope I can be half as rich as they are someday." Margaret wiped tears from her eyes. Harold pulled Nathan into a hug. "You're already rich, buddy. You've got the most important thing figured out at 12 years old. That's a head start most people never get." As the sun set over their backyard, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, Harold thought about the journey that had brought them here. The 43 years of deliberately chosen poverty. The 7 years of degradation in Dennis's basement. The cold night on a church floor. The DNA test. The fortune revealed. The foundation built. The lives changed. If he could go back and do it differently, would he? Would he claim the inheritance at 23 and live a life of comfort? Would he tell Margaret about the money and give her the security she deserved? He honestly didn't know. Because yes, they'd suffered more than necessary. Yes, Margaret had endured hardships she shouldn't have had to endure. But they'd also built something real, something earned. Something that money alone could never have created. They'd built character in the forge of struggle. They'd proven that love could survive poverty. They'd discovered that dignity wasn't about what you owned, but about how you treated people when you had nothing to gain from it. And now, with the resources to back up their values, they were changing the world in ways that only people who'd lived through struggle could understand. They weren't philanthropists trying to earn good press. They were advocates who'd been there, who knew exactly what homelessness and poverty and discarding felt like. That authenticity, that lived experience, made all the difference. "What are you thinking about?" Margaret asked, noticing his faraway expression. "I'm thinking," Harold said slowly, "that maybe Uncle Thomas knew exactly what he was doing when he gave me that inheritance. Maybe he knew I needed to become someone worthy of it before I could claim it. Maybe 43 years was exactly how long it took." Margaret considered that. "Or maybe he just loved you and wanted you to be taken care of, and you made it more complicated than it needed to be." Harold laughed. "That's also possible. Either way," Margaret said, taking his hand, "we're here now, and we're doing something good with it. That's what matters." She was right. It wasn't about the path they'd taken, or whether it was the best path or the right path. It was about what they chose to do with where they'd ended up. And they'd chosen compassion over bitterness, service over luxury, purpose over comfort. They'd chosen to be exactly who they'd always been, just with more resources to back it up. And in doing so, they'd proven that wealth doesn't change who you are. It reveals it. Money is just a tool. What matters is the hands that hold it, and the heart that guides them. As darkness fell, and stars began to appear, Harold, Margaret, and Nathan went inside. There were dishes to wash, homework to check, a foundation report to review. Normal things, everyday things, the substance of a life well lived. Because at the end of everything, Harold and Margaret had learned the most important lesson of all. True wealth isn't measured in dollars. It's measured in love, given freely, integrity maintained fiercely, and purpose pursued relentlessly. It's measured in lives touched, dignity restored, and hope rekindled. They'd been poor and they'd been rich. And they'd learned that the distance between those two states was far smaller than most people thought. Because whether you had everything or nothing, what mattered was the same: who you chose to be, how you treated people, and what legacy you left behind. Harold and Margaret chose kindness. They chose service. They chose love. And in doing so, they showed the world that sometimes the people who look poorest are actually the richest of all, not despite their struggles, but because of them. Anyone can have money fall into their lap, but not everyone can maintain their character when the world treats them like they're worthless. Harold and Margaret spent their lives proving that dignity doesn't come from a bank account. It comes from how you treat people when you have nothing to gain. As the sun sets over the Whitmore Foundation's newest community center, built on the site of that old church, where two forgotten souls once sought shelter, their legacy continues. Not in marble monuments or bronze plaques, but in every warm bed, every hot meal, and every person who learns they still matter. Because the real story was never about the money. It was about two people who understood that the greatest inheritance you can leave isn't wealth. It's wisdom. And wisdom says this: never forget where you came from. Never let cruelty define you. And never stop believing that kindness is the most valuable currency in the world. For Harold and Margaret, the journey from that frozen sidewalk to financial freedom wasn't about revenge. It was about redemption. Not theirs, but the world's. A reminder that sometimes the people we overlook, the ones we discard and dismiss, are carrying treasures we can't begin to imagine. The end. Up next, two more powerful stories that will restore your faith in the resilience of the human spirit. Click to continue the journey. And don't forget to hit subscribe if you believe true wealth is measured in character, not currency.